Capricorn is said to be a traditional sign, but what about the extremely non-traditional Capricorns, such as David Bowie and Marilyn Manson? How do you explain them? You tend to see Capricorn suns expressed in a certain way. The stereotype is the traditionalist driving a Volvo to a corporate job with goals of rising up the system. But the only real guarantee is that inside the person with the sun in Cap, you'll find basic Capricorn traits and strengths and weaknesses. We know that Capricorn is a cardinal sign, one that begins a season. Therefore, it has drive. Its symbol is a goat, a creature with hooked feet and an obsession for climbing up a mountain, up a structure, up a ladder. We know that Marilyn Manson and David Bowie possessed this typical Capricorn trait because they were both successful in a highly competitive field. They were good enough with money to make and keep millions. Despite their environments and lifestyles, they were responsible enough and had follow through enough to establish themselves. In true Capricorn style, Manson said, "I'm afraid of losing control, I'm afraid of failing, and I'm afraid of chaos." Marilyn Manson was a typical Capricorn in many ways. He knew the rules and he was keenly aware of what was expected of him by society. So, why did his appearance and some of his behaviors veer so far off the mainstream? Because he also claimed to fear being normal. He didn't want to look and act like everybody else. In fact, he once said, "I despise the idea of being a regular sheep in society." This is called overcompensation. That means going in the opposite direction of what you are. If he wasn't totally normal, he wouldn't be running from it. His early education took place in a fire and brimstone Christian school. So when he bounced off the limits and structures to which he was very much attuned, he chose to go dark and gothy and devilish. He went in a way that would make Christians uncomfortable for decades. And interestingly, his natal chart contains Saturn in Aries in the ninth house. That placement is associated with the fire and brimstone preacher who's banging his fist on the pulpit. So I wouldn't be surprised if Manson's whole life and work is, in essence, a kind of preaching to, a preaching against the norm. Now, David Bowie is a different story. We know he possessed Capricorn traits like drive, ambition, good timing, a love of productivity. But what motivated his atypical behaviors and his constantly shifting identity? His Mars-Sun conjunction tells that story. The Sun seeks an identity. Mars, right next to it, gives that quest a lot of energy and passion. And in most cases, you would see this Mars-Sun pair making a success of itself within normal societal expectations. But his Sun-Mars conjunction is in the 12th house. Planets in the 12th begin dissolving and disintegrating. So with the Sun and Mars in the 12th, that search for the self becomes very elusive. Capricorn here loses some of its rigidity and conformity, but that drive to find himself was still there all the while. And so, like a fish swimming through a wardrobe at Universal Studios, he looked for himself in every outfit and every persona he adopted. He even made a soundtrack of that search, flowing across a variety of musical genres and leaving his influence. Bowie's atypical behavior was, in my estimation, actually a byproduct of a greater search for who he was. He was still possessed by Capricorn's drive to climb all the way up to the top. And since the 12th house brings imagination to Capricorn and loosens its boundaries, he went way higher than the top of a mountain. He went all the way to mega wealthy rock star married to supermodel, a situation he once called heaven. Now that's a high climb. And by the way, this is a great example of how a house placement can be a mediating factor in a natal chart. This is why an individual reading, a face-to-face interpretation, can bring out an accuracy that causes astrology to be a very impressive tool. Some of the myths you tell differ from some of the versions I've heard. Why is that? Mythological stories were written over and over again and told over and over again throughout thousands of years. So, yes, different versions developed. The details may differ a bit, but the underlying message is usually the same. I usually pick the story that defines the god or goddess that I'm referring to in the most distinctive way. If I'm talking about Saturn, I'm going to use the story in which he's behaving in the most Saturnine fashion, or most like the planet in the zodiac. I think that's important because there are some stories in which Saturn acts in a way that could be confused with Jupiter if you're new to it. The version of the myth I use comes down to a judgment call about which one distinguishes the planet best and gets the lesson across. In the video on Pisces, you say that Pisces is a cosmic dustbin, that it contains a little piece of all the other signs. I've heard this before in terms of Pisces, and I want to know if this is true of the other signs. Are they made up of the ones that came before them? And if not, why not? No, the other signs aren't made up of the ones that came before them because no other sign is designed for that. No other sign has the inclination. In the symbol for Pisces, there are two fish with a space in between them. Because of that clean, unclaimed space, Pisces is able to absorb energies. No other sign in the zodiac is made that way. Aries doesn't have any sign before it, and even if it did, the ram would be inclined to call that an invasion and fight it off. Leo might make the four signs that come before it into an audience, but I don't see the lion sharing the spotlight. Scorpio would be stinging the seven signs that come before it. And those signs wouldn't have much luck getting through the exoskeleton anyway. Also, consider that these two fish are headed in opposite directions, not aware of one another and not touching. Pisces isn't whole. It has a porous experience of life. And so 11 signs are able to slip in. Pisces is called the cosmic dustbin because it's the nature of Pisces to disintegrate and dissolve. So even as it absorbs the other signs, it doesn't integrate them or bring them together into a whole. And having access to bits and pieces of the entire zodiac is what makes Pisces the most flexible sign in the wheel. I've been hearing a lot about the Saturn return. Can you explain what that is? A return is when a planet in your natal chart goes all the way around the zodiac and comes back to its natal placement. A Saturn return is when Saturn returns to its natal placement. The Saturn return happens at around the age of 30. This has always been known as astrological adulthood. It's a time when you're considered officially grown up. Throughout most of history, the Saturn return was actually a time when there was a changing of the guard. People's parents were dying. Inheritances were being passed, children were marrying, places were being taken as the head of the family or the head of the family business. A 30-year-old was considered old enough to function as a solid member of society. Saturn was, for a very long time, the last known planet, so the Saturn return was the most serious thing that happened since a native's birth. Today, the Saturn return still happens at around the age of 30, but it's no longer a changing of the guard. We have, after all, many more years ahead of us now. We might not yet be married or have any children or own any property. With increased longevity, a 30-year-old is considered young and is probably not in any real position of authority in the world. But it's still considered a big event, and it's still known as astrological adulthood. Now, during the Saturn return, we get lessons in adulthood. We're forced to stand alone in a new way. And as youthful comforts fall away, there's usually some depression and lessons in duty and responsibility. We lose the arrogance of youth, and we realize that rather than set the world on fire, we'll probably make a modest difference. Some charts are designed for a more traumatic Saturn return, and others have it easier. But in general, it's a time of facing limitations that cause us to look at life more realistically. Thank you for watching Secrets from an Astrologer's Desk. Next is all the ways you can get in touch for a birth chart reading and full astrological services. I'm Joy. More videos to come.